This
going
conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so I was going to say that we're recording the webinar. As a reminder, again, it's optional, but we're still asking folks to sign in with your name and agency if you haven't already done so. I do want to apologize to everybody who joined us this morning for the technical difficulties. Every time we work a problem out, something else arises, but I think we've figured out all of our technical issues. However, if we start having problems again, especially with sound, if you could just, someone can just put that in the chat box so we can see that and continue to troubleshoot. Also, today I've got a PowerPoint presentation. If at some point we're going to make it available, we just don't know right now if it's going to be posted on the website, which is the preferable way to do this, or if we'll be emailing it out. So again, thanks, welcome, and welcome back to all those who joined us this morning. Now, let's just go ahead and get started. If y'all are like me, we've had a long day with some meetings. As a reminder, we are going to repeat this session January 21st if you want to attend again or have other staff attend. The link and all that will be provided. Now, when we get started, I felt like we needed to look at some fundamentals of goals and objectives and evaluations because it all ties back, and it might give a little bit of groundwork to some of you all. Some of you out there do a good job with writing good goals and objectives, and certainly know more than I do. But this workshop is to help maybe provide additional information and to help those that need a little more guidance. So to get started, let's just do an overview of evaluations. There are several types of evaluations and methods. Sometimes it's used as methods. And so I've got some listed here for you. We're not going to go into all of them, but there's formative, summative, goal-based, process-based, impact-based, and outcome-based. So for the purposes of what we are going to cover and what you as grant applicants need to know, we're just going to really look at the last three. Whoops, let's see. Yeah, so the first one is process-based. And usually when you think of a process-based evaluation, it usually deals with numbers. This is where you report actual numbers. And so what it does is it relates back to what the activities and tasks that you're carried out. And also based on numbers, the overall picture is the process-based will analyze strengths and weaknesses. Impact and outcome based evaluation is they're often used interchangeably when they're described as a process. The interesting thing is that if you go out there and look at definitions, even the field, there's just a lot of inconsistency of how they're defined and interpreted. Now, if anyone out there is familiar with completing logic models, because a lot of times grants require this, the distinction between impact and outcome-based evaluations is more clearly understood. It makes a real clear picture. But now for OAIV, we're not required to do logic models. And also the terms impact and outcome is used, a note that I have on here, somewhat interchangeably. Here's another look at the differences between impact and outcome. Impact is the broader sense. It also looks at measuring effects over a longer period of time, where the outcome is it's predetermined and it measures change. And another thing about impact, the impact is measuring what it is that you hope to accomplish, and the outcome is actually measuring what you do to accomplish, and it's also within a grant period. It's not long term. So that is some of the differences. Here's some other jargon about impact-based evaluations. It's kind of lengthy, but basically it's looking at the overall effectiveness of the goals and accomplishing those for your programs as opposed to specific outcomes. So you notice I'm not reading all this to you. That's why we want to make this available. One thing about the webinar is it can't really be very interactive, so I apologize for that. Jan is going to be watching out for questions, and we really hope to answer those closer to the end of the session. Anyway, so the outcome-based this is where, an outcome-based evaluation or objective is measurable and it's time-limited. And the one important thing is it measures change and behavior that you as an agency has brought about because of what the services you're providing. Now, measuring outcomes requires a significant commitment of staff time and some adequate and reliable tools. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this. As you probably realized through the RFPs, and after talking about the different three types of evaluations, is that OAIV uses an outcome-based. They want to know if you're making a change and what kind of impact you're making on the services that you're delivering. So their primary approach is outcome-based. Now, a lot of times you have to use, I know with my experience, you use a combination of the process, which are the numbers, if you look at it that way, the impact, which is more long-term, and the outcome. So even when you're working on your OAIV grant, you may be using a little bit of these processes, these methods, because sometimes you have to provide a process-based objective and so that you can clearly illustrate what it is that you're trying to accomplish. Sometimes you can't avoid it, so it's not just all in one. However, now, if you do use all of these different methods, you still must measure the outcome and impact. That is the primary focus. Just a little bit about qualitative and quantitative data, because if you use a combination of these processes, then you're going to use a combination of numbers and information. So I've given here you a little chart about the differences. Of course, quantitative are the strict numbers, like we serve 400 victims in our domestic violence shelter. Now, the qualitative data is information that we're gaining from the individuals that we're serving. And, it's information, so it's going to be reported in narrative form. We're going to use tools like questionnaires, interviews, observation to collect the data. And it measures change in knowledge and behavior. And that's what OAIV is looking at to see if you're making any difference in your services. The third fundamental is the OAIV grant guidelines. I'm not going to read all this to you, but I've included it on this PowerPoint in case you want to copy. But this is straight out of the grant, the RFP. You state your goals in broad terms. The objectives, again, straight out of the RFP. You have to provide a statement that describes the intended outcome. They should be SMART objectives. You need to, it's not necessarily understood. Well, in some cases it is understood who your target population is, but you still need to indicate that in an outcome statement. And the last sentence says that you can have as many objectives as you need depending on your proposed project, which I really should have edited this out. If you attended the session this morning, you know that the objectives are limited to 20 objectives. And I tell you honestly, I wouldn't have a grant that had 20 objectives under one goal statement. That's a lot of work. That's trying to accomplish a whole lot. And if you see yourself with more than 20 objectives for one goal, you might want to reassess and maybe pare down a little bit about what you're trying to accomplish. Activities, these are the steps, the tasks, and all of that to complete, to get to your accomplishing your outcome. The activities is also a place where you can describe your evidence-based interventions. If you're doing any culturally sensitive type services, it may be the activities is where you can include some of that information. It's going to be in your narrative, your project narrative. It may not necessarily be in your objective, but these are the things that you're doing in your activities to get to your objectives. Activities also need to say who's going to be providing these services. A lot of times folks forget to include that. Writing the goals and objectives for your grant, I did want to point this out. This particular task in the grant is scored at 20%. I don't know if you've all have really taken a chance to look at the scoring that's in the RFP, but your budget's worth 20%, your implementation is 20%, and your goals and objectives are 20%. So, that's essentially each section is 20% of your grant. So it's weighed heavily. So I just wanted to point that out. Here is another look at of goals and objectives and activities, maybe to help you all kind of discern between what does this really mean on the big level. So I'm just going to kind of read some of this. The goals, broad in scope, they're general intentions, they're based on ideas, they're longer term, and they're hard to measure. Where objectives is the complete opposite of that. They're narrow in scope, they're specific, precise, based on fact, they're shorter term, which means you're going to accomplish those within the grant period, and they're measurable. Goals, remember, focus on the end results, and objectives focus on the outcome and impact. Now, activities are all those planned tasks and steps that you're going to do to reach your to reach your objective. And, that's where you would, again, put in stuff like your evidence-based intervention, any of those, trauma-informed care. This is where you can mention some of those. Now, I've also provided you with some common terms used when you're writing your goals, objectives, and activities. So for your goals, there's some common visionary terms, and sometimes you may start the goal out, as to decrease or to develop something. These words really are all kind of the same, but with objectives and activities, they're going to be more action words, and there's a list of some examples of those terms to use. Good goals, objectives, and activities are going to use these type of visionary terms and action terms. So that's just a little helpful hint there for you. Just a little helpful hints on goals. If you go out and look on the web about writing SMART objectives, a lot of times you'll pull up information that talks about writing SMART goals. But when you put all that information together, the documents that talk about writing SMART goals look just like a document for writing SMART objectives. So if you've gone out there and looked at this stuff, just to clear up any confusion is, for our purposes, goals are going to be those broad statements about what you wish to accomplish, where the objectives are going to be SMART objectives, and we're going to follow those criteria. Another thing to keep in mind when you're writing goals, and some of you will write or submit applications for all 5 applications, is you need to know that grant funders' goals, regulations, and guidelines. So it's not just the source of where the funding's coming from, but also those goals and regulations and guidelines that come through OAIV. So it's a tall order for us to keep in mind when we're writing goals and objectives. You know, always refer back to your mission. This all needs to be in line. Sometimes we'll see goals that are completely outside the scope of an agency's mission. So always refer to your agency's mission when you're looking at what these grants will pay for. SMART objectives. And this, a lot of y'all are probably,
There's a question, but can you provide those keywords again?
Oh, okay. Let me just back up for a minute. Someone wanted to look at the keywords. If you want to just take a quick picture of that. The PowerPoint will be provided to y'all at some point, but there are those words. So I'm going to give you just a second, pull out your phone, take a screenshot, and then we're going to move on. Okay. So I'm not sure how many of y'all are familiar with SMART objectives, what kind of training you've had on SMART objectives. So, you know, we're really going to go into this because this is a really big part of writing goals and objectives. Again, OAIV wants to see SMART objectives this year, and as y'all heard, they're going into a more competitive process. So it's important that your objectives are SMART and that you follow the criteria and the guidelines that are set forth for writing SMART objectives. The SMART objectives is not something that the OAIV office came up with. This is something pretty standard in the field, as many of you know. So I really don't want to read, but I will kind of read this. SMART objectives are clear, specific statements describing the intended outcome impact of the project. They're straightforward, and they answer the basic questions of who, what, when, where, why. And sometimes there's kind of a combination of that. Sometimes we may not necessarily have where, you know, that's going to be our service area. So we don't have to take this too literal when you're answering who, what, when, where, and why, but you need to make sure that your grant clearly covers all of this. It's somewhere in the application. Now, there's some things in the SMART objectives that you're not going to be able to leave out, and that's who and when. It includes a description of who will be affected. Again, I just said that who. That's your target population. You know, it's kind of assumed if you're writing a grant for victim services or for, let's say, a domestic violence victim, that your intended target population is domestic violence victims. But you still need to include that in your objective. This is the other really important thing about a SMART objective is that it has to include what will happen. What are you changing? Are you changing knowledge, behavior? And what behavior or knowledge is that? And measurable. You have to have a defined period of time of when you expect that this outcome will be accomplished. So a lot of y'all may be familiar with this, but here it is. What is SMART? Specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time limited. So I'm going to break this down for you a little bit. Specific. Now, we've said this before, that you clearly have to indicate what the expected performance and or outcome will be. Measurable. you're not necessarily going to say how you're going to measure that information in your objective, although you may, because you may mention a client survey. But you have to, as an agency, have a measurement tool so that you can collect the information, so that you can determine or measure if that objective has been achieved. The tool has to be concrete. It's got to have concrete criteria, and it has to have methods for measuring progress. We're going to talk a little bit about this in just a little while. Now, when you're writing your objective, if you're writing an objective and you've determined that you just can't measure it, you don't know how to measure this outcome, that means you cannot determine if your work is making a difference. And sometimes that does happen. And this happens, what you need as an agency do is to either consider rewriting the objective so that it's clearly measurable, or you might just need to modify your whole approach or completely review your plan or proposal and go to plan B. When we talk about an objective being achievable, this is something that's not in, you don't write it in the objective, but it's something, an objective that when it's stated, that as a reader, we know that it's reasonable and something your agency can accomplish. Now, as agencies, you're going to have to determine, is this outcome reasonable? Even if you write it down and you put it out, you have to go back and look, and you have to look at things like, do we have the number of staff to do this? Do we have the expertise within our staff to accomplish this? Is it reasonable? The other thing is it's got to be relevant or realistic. And when you look at if there's going to be a real benefit to your victim population, the one thing you have to do is you've got to go back and look at what is that grant paying for? What's the grant purposes? What are the goals, objectives? If your objective doesn't include a benefit that's a part of that grant, then you're kind of off the track. So, a really far-fetched example would be that you're writing a sexual assault or rape crisis grant, and you're talking a lot about domestic violence victims. First of all, your target population is kind of skewed, but also what's the sexual assault grant? What's the real benefit to domestic violence victims? Like I said, it's a far-fetched example, and we do know that domestic violence victims are often sexual assault victims. But the main purpose of saying this is because you have to look at, does this benefit is really towards your target population, and it's part of the grant goals. Time limited. And we know that for OAIV purposes that our time limited grants, if we're going to put something in there, we need to accomplish it by the end of the grant period. Not all objectives are going to be completed by the end of the grant period. Most probably will, but then you'll have some that may be completed halfway through the year, 3/4 of the way through the year. But no matter when it's to be achieved, it has to be a time frame that is done within that grant period. I keep wanting to ask, are there any questions, but it's too difficult right now. So activities. So I just kind of listed, their steps, tasks, efforts, events. Again, there's that evidence-based intervention that are conducted for your specific project plan. Now, the activities also are the details. Sometimes people kind of underestimate the role that writing good activities really is, but you need to make sure that your activities are, again, they're reasonable. they're achievable within your time frame, and they're well thought out. The activities, I said earlier, you have to indicate who's going to conduct that. And then just as a note, and I put this because there's some questions I've had, but each objective should have at least one activity statement related to that desired outcome. Now, I personally think that you're going to have more than one activity, but you know, because if you've got an outcome that you're trying to accomplish or make change in 12 months, you're going to be doing more than one activity to get that accomplished. If you attended this morning, you'll see, and we're going to get to that in a minute, that the GAMS application allows for you to put as many activities as you want. Just a little note on the timeline. It used to be that for each activity, you put a timeline. Well, OAIV's changed that up a little bit. So the timeline really is going to refer to when are you going to have this objective completed and not necessarily the activity. So I've got a screenshot here of the GAMS section where you do the goals and objectives. If you, I think most of you on the call today probably have sat through either one of those workshops where you've seen it. But, you know, your objective goes here. Wait a minute. Your goal goes here, your objective, and you've got where you can list 20 of them. Under each objective, you can put activities, as many as you want right here. Then your completion date will go back to completing your objective. Now, we're getting ready to go through some samples that I've developed for you to help hopefully illustrate all of that, all what I've already discussed. But I do want to stop, go off script, and see if we have any questions right now.
There's not any on.
Okay. So if y'all are ready to move on, I'm going to give you the good, bad, and ugly. Okay. I first wanted to start off with bad, so we can move to the good. But here's an example of, I guess maybe the goal statement's not so bad, but if you look at the objectives and activities, they are not smart at all. And also, they're really focused on process-based evaluations and not outcome. So the objective is to provide emergency shelter services to 300 victims. If you go back and look at your SMART chart, it's not measurable. It's not telling you what intended change or outcome that you want. If you look at the activities, activity 1 and 2, it just simply says staff. You know, for OAIV purposes, they really want to know what staff, you know, the staff position, or if it's all the grant-funded staff or this particular grant. Look at activity 3. Actually, no, I think it's the next one. So anyway, it's just, you know, if folks have been around a long time working on grants, this is what we used to submit, the bad.
I think our sound might have popped off. It was just going too good. Say something, Sandra.
Okay, it seems like we were having a little sound problem. Can y'all hear me?
It's back on.
Okay. So we had a little interruption there with sound again. We have determined that the technical problems have to do with the equipment and internet Wi-Fi here at the Institute. After today, we hope to conduct our webinars at other places so that we make sure that we don't continue to have these technical difficulties for you. So I'm not real sure. I'm going to go back. I'm not real sure where it all that you didn't hear me, but
keep talking to somebody says they can't hear you.
I can hear you. Okay, Charlotte can hear me.
Okay.
Okay. So what I was saying, I'm not sure who all heard this. You know, way back in the day, back in the 80s and 90s, this is kind of how we wrote goals and objectives, and you see they were all processed evaluations. This is not what our funders want now, and so we have now moved to what we call SMART objectives. Okay, so let's look at objective 2 for this bad example. Provide 150 counseling sessions, and look at here. Okay, we think we restored the sound. Can you let me know if you can hear me now?
I can see that they can.
Oh, you can't? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry, y'all. I'm just so sorry. Okay, so back to objective 2. If you look at activity 1, I know if I was a grant reviewer, I would see that activity 1 is probably not all maybe reasonable, because this is not something you're typically going to see, where you've got a case manager scheduling sessions for your counselor. And you look at activity 2, therapy sessions will be provided to all clients. No, that's just way overstated. That may be your intentions, but that's not going to happen, because all of your clients are not going to participate for one reason or another. Now look at objective 3, hire a case manager. That's not an objective, that's an activity. Okay, so that's the nitty-gritty on the bad. Any questions? Okay, let's move on to the good. So what I'm going to illustrate here is an example using the VOCA grant. And so what I did is, the first thing I did is I went back and I reviewed the grant purposes. And for all purposes, that's really their goals. Then I also looked at the RFP for VOCA use of funds and allowable activities. So after taking all that information together, then I developed these goals and objectives. So the first one is respond to the emotional and safety needs of victims of interpersonal violence. Now, respond may not necessarily be a visionary term, but when you are when you already have an established program, You're either maintaining what you're doing, or you're developing something new, or you're enhancing it. So sometimes with, longstanding, ongoing services, your goal may or may not have a visionary statement unless it's something new or different. Okay. So, objective 1. At the end of June 30, 2021, 80% of victims of interpersonal violence who have completed the client survey will report they are more hopeful about the future. I will have to say, we don't want folks cutting and pasting the objectives and activities. Some of this stuff I've kind of left vague intentionally. And when we go through the rest of this exercise, you'll only see maybe 1 or 2 activities. I will say that with these pretty big outcome objectives, you're going to have a lot more activities involved than just a couple of examples here. So just a word of caution on all of that. Did it go out again? So for activity 1, crisis intervention, let's go back to the objective. It's time limited. It says who's going to be affected. It says what we want to happen. And this actually says, how we're going to get the data. Now, if you notice that this objective is talking in terms of a percentage, and it doesn't have 100%, because anyone who works with client surveys will know that you're not going to get 100% participation. So the way this reads, 80% of victims who have completed the client survey. So let's say that you served 100 clients that month, but you only were able to administer about 50 client surveys, which is probably typical. There's just a lot of reasons why those client surveys aren't completed. So if you then look at the 50% of the 50 clients, 50% of who completed the client survey, what this is saying, 80% of those 50 who responded will report that they feel more hopeful about the future. Activity 1, crisis intervention will be provided to victims by the case manager and licensed counselor. That says what you're going to do, who's going to do it. If you've got more than one office, you can certainly put where it's going to be provided. Activity 2, the rape crisis intervention specialist and volunteers will respond to emergency requests for support, advocacy, and accompaniment of victims of sexual assault. Again, these are just some examples. Activity 3, we talk about some additional services provided and what all staff's going to do that. Activity 4, now in this one, because let's say this grant has like 15 staff funded by VOCA, instead of listing them all, I chose to use all VOCA-funded staff will participate in cultural diversity and competent training services training. And then activity 5, this is an activity. This is where you're collecting the data. I kind of include that as an activity because it's such a big part of what you do. Now let me go back for just a minute where we talk about crisis intervention and emergency response. Remember what I said earlier, that this is where you can also address, you're providing culturally specific services to the Hispanic population. This is, again, where under your activities is where you can talk about those other types of specific services that you're providing. Now, let's look at objective 2. At the end of the grant, at the end of the June 30th, 80%, I just stuck with that number. These are numbers that you will have to come up that realistically represent your agency. So it may not be 80%, it may be lower, it may be higher. And you'll come up with that. So 80% of victims of interpersonal violence who have completed the client survey will report they have an increased understanding and ability to cope and manage their trauma. Now, I kind of lumped all that together for y'all again just for demo purposes, but if I was writing this for a grant, I don't know if I would lump all that together because it's just so much, but that may be a personal preference. Look, activity 1, evidence-based trauma-informed care therapy will be provided by the licensed counselor. Notice that I put licensed counselor in there because the grant's going to be talking about that. Objective 3, victims will report they have an increased knowledge of their safety and will have a safety plan on file. Now remember, if we go back to the goal statement, and I'm just going to flip back to it real quick, the goal is to respond to the emotional and safety needs of victims of interpersonal violence, okay? So let me get back to objective 3. So the activity, the court advocate will provide safety planning, personal advocacy, case management, and court education. And then activity 2 is where we're going to provide the victim about information on victims' comp, Bill of Rights, and services provided by the Attorney General's office. Okay, so that is a little sample of measurable and SMART objectives and activities. Is the sound down again? Any questions? Oh, there was a question from Luann. I can
you see it?
Yeah, but I'm sorry, I'm talking out loud. I'm reading Luann's question. I'm not really sure how to answer that. I would probably need more information on the question. But I think either way would be okay. If you want, we can talk about this instead of doing it chat. Okay. Now, we may have someone from the OAIV office with us today. Maybe Heather's on with us. Is this something, Heather, you can answer, or Charlotte? Luann, when you say, should we break down the program specifics in the objectives, that's what I'm not real sure what you're referring to. Are you talking about your, like, domestic violence shelter, your crisis program? If you are, then I would say, you know, if you're trying to address their trauma and their emotional needs, I would break down that in the activities. Do what? Oh. Hello?
Sandra?
Yeah?
It just, our phone just said unmuted, but we didn't touch it. Y'all unmuted?
No, we did on our
We
end,
did,
because we
so-
didn't know if you wanted to ask the question. Did you hear me? Are you talking about?
Sandra, this is Sandy.
Hey, Sandy.
Hey, darling. My question was, you know, when it comes to the like human trafficking, sexual assault, domestic violence, do you prefer for that to be differentiated in the objective end or in the activity end?
Now, I can't really answer that because that's really probably going to be an OAIV question, but I could say, for me, I think that you could address all of that in the activity, because the outcome's going to be the same, right? You want to respond to their emotional needs, yeah, that's what I think. So we need to get some clarity on that from Heather. But I think that doing it in the activities, if no reason, if you start breaking it down, it's going to be so long.
Right.
It's going to be, you're going to have the target population and all the same objectives and activities, just long. But I think you could do it like that. Okay, I'm going to make a note, and we'll get clarity on that for you.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, now, are there any other questions? I know that this was a lot of information in a short period of time. I'm hoping that I did give you enough information and clarity on this so that you will have the information and the tools to go back and write these goals and objectives. Now, we're not done because I still have some more. Now we're going to get to the ugly. This is a little far-fetched, but I wanted to come up with an example and just kind of go over it with you. So the goal I came up with is to develop an infant intervention services program to reduce intergenerational violence. Now, I don't know if any of you all recognize the problem right off with just reading the goal. But you know what? The goals are goals. They're broad. That's where we shoot for the stars. Okay, so when we're looking at, so let's say we're an agency, we got staff sitting around, and we really have identified that there's a big problem with intergenerational violence, just what we see in our own community. So we want to do something about that to reduce that. So we're going to come up with this program, and we want to start young. So we're going to start with infants. So here's the objective. Okay, so at the end of the grant period, we're going to demonstrate stabilization and decreased tension in children or infants. Okay, so anybody see a problem with any of this? And then I just left activity off completely. Okay, although this goal is very ambitious, we've got two things. What are we really going to do for infants to reduce intergenerational violence? And when I say infants, I'm talking about 0 to 12 months. And how are we going to measure this? Well, therein lies the problem. We want to do these wonderful services, but there's just no way to measure this. Coming up with an objective that is reasonable and relevant and just makes sense, it's kind of difficult when you're talking about making these kind of behavioral changes and knowledge in infants. It's just not going to happen, right? So when you're looking at writing your goals and objectives, you have to make sure it is something that's measurable, and you have to make sure you have the right tools to measure. Now, remember what I said earlier. Measuring outcome objectives, which are quantitative, which means it's information, they're very difficult to measure. It's difficult in our field to even get the right tool, and if we do have the right tool, it's difficult sometimes to get the participant, which is the victim, to give us that information. Now, so let's go back to this agency. They really want to do something about reducing intergenerational violence. In a situation like this, you would want to bring together some of your staff together. If you've got a children's program staff, you want to bring them in, kind of talk about, brainstorm, that sort of thing. And once you do that, you can come up with, we do have a way that we can address intergenerational violence with young children. But starting with infants is not the right way. So let's redo our goal completely. And that is, you want to develop an evidence-based children's program to reduce intergenerational violence or something close to that. So you can do some of this. Now, also reducing intergenerational violence isn't just going to involve children. It's also going to involve the caretaker. You're going to do that through parenting, through specialized training or other services that you can provide. So you can do something about it, but you can't do it with just infants. And you can't do it with just children because you've got to have those parents involved too. So I gave you the ugly, and then I gave you kind of a solution. Any questions? Okay. Measurable outcomes. Okay, I've already said this. You know, it's difficult to measure. It requires a lot of staff time because you have to make sure that your staff and usually you're going to do this through client surveys, but we'll talk about tools in just a minute. But with a survey, you've got to be able to your staff's got to do it. And this is something that probably most all staff need to be engaged in, because if you're going to have, especially like shelters or maybe rape crisis centers, things like that, you're going to have clients coming in and out at different hours. Their length of stay, or the time of service that you're providing, the time that you're providing the services to clients may vary from a couple of days to a couple of months. You know, court advocates, you know, it's the same thing. Sometimes your time with the clients is going to be even much short term than that. So staff have to stay on top of getting these tools and questionnaires to the client so they can let you know if what you're doing is making a difference, because that's what OAIV wants to know. So, you know, what kind of tools do you use? Again, client surveys. What do the client surveys look like? Let's see, I think I might have this on the next page. Sorry, y'all. You know, a client survey it can be two. It can be qualitative and quantitative. By quantitative, I'm not really just looking at numbers, but we're looking more like at a Likert scale, where you ask the victim questions and they will rate it 1 to 5. And that's, you know, an easier way. And these questions that you're going to ask them are going to tie back to what you're trying to measure, what you're trying to accomplish in your objectives. So if you are saying that you want to reduce their stress level, then you ask them that, and you give them a scale of 1 to 5. Or you could do it a yes, no. And sometimes you have to weigh whether you want to do the Likert scale or the yes, no. And honestly, the yes, no is kind of simple to probably manage and collect, because remember, you got to collect it and analyze it. But you either did or you didn't reduce their stress level, as opposed to a scale of, well, you kind of did, but you didn't really, but you did a great job. So you have to look at the questions and really decide what's going to be the best way to collect that information per the response that you've provided them to give, right? A yes, no, or a 1 through 5. But always, and again, always go back to what are you saying in your outcomes? Because if this is the only way you're going to be able to collect a lot of the information that's quantitative. Now, another part of the quantitative issue for the client surveys is where you can ask open-ended questions, and you can get information from there as well. Using open-ended questions sometimes may not be ideal, but to measure a certain outcome. But as an agency, you still want to be able to provide that, because you want to hear back from the victims. That information can help you determine other problems, other issues that are going on, maybe help you come up with some ideas or resolutions. So using those are still a good idea. I already said this once, but I'm going to say it again. If you cannot measure the outcome, you cannot determine if your work is making a difference. So you need to reconsider modifying it or changing your plans. So just a little recap here. When developing your objectives, you might want to consider this. What are your tools that you're going to use to measure the data you're going to collect? And real important is, remember I said it takes a lot of staff time? Who's going to collect it and maintain it? Because once, who's going to administer the surveys? And then once that's done, what happens to the surveys? Because I tell you, if you don't have someone assigned to do it, if it's not you, that stuff gets lost on the shelf or gets lost in files, and your data's lost. And now you got it from the victim, but now you don't have any place to. You can't compile it because you don't know where it is. So you need to consider who's going to collect it, and then once it's collected and reported on, where do you maintain this? A lot of agencies are going to these data management systems, so it's really pretty easy, and some are still using paper files. So you have to, work best for your agency. And then, just kind of look at how will you really know if you've accomplished your objective? The objective said 80% reporting will do this. Do you really want to stay at that number? Do you want to increase it? Anyway, just consider those kind of things. Now, here are some measurement tools. The client surveys, which I've already talked about, and they're in line with your goals and objectives. Here I talked about, the qualitative and quantitative. A big question is when to administer the client surveys. And I bet you, whether it's domestic violence shelter, rape crisis program, you all struggle with when to administer a survey, especially if this is what you're using to collect your data. If you wait until like the end of their shelter stay or the end of the court, let's say it's a felon, it's in a circuit court. If you wait till the very end of when those services are going to be terminated with the client, you may not get that information, or you may not even get to the fact that they're going to be with you that whole time. So now you've got a client that you helped, but you have no information on. You might want to consider administering these surveys. Let's say if they're a shelter victim, after being there for 3 weeks or something like that, whatever you decide in your office is to administer it then. That's just some suggestions. A counselor may want to do the same thing. If you're seeing clients that are non-residential, you might want to consider administering these surveys some way halfway through, or even you don't even know when halfway through their stay is going to be, but something a predetermined time. Okay, we've been seeing this client for 4 sessions. That's when we administer it. That way, you're sure to get some information. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. I was going to say something else on that. We talked earlier about you're just not going to get 100% participation. It's just not realistic. So even if you put something in a goal and objective that we're going to do this at 100%, 99.9% of the time, that's just not going to happen. Because we're not, first of all, we're not going to, again, have clients to participate in the client survey, so we're not going to know. So keep that in mind. And when you're doing that, that's where you come up with a plan of how you're going to write your objectives that it has some good, sound, reasonable expectations, like the 80% of people who responded to the surveys. If you're in something other than, a domestic violence shelter, you want to consider different types of, even if you are in a shelter, Any agency providing direct victim services should be able to have their own unique and customized survey. For programs that do counseling or court advocacy and shelter services, you may want to consider, and again, this goes back to how your goals and objectives are written, that you have different surveys that are administered to the victim by different staff. This does put a lot of paperwork on the client, and I guess staff too, but if you're talking about all this court advocacy and safety planning while you're sheltering clients, you need to get that information. Do you want to do it with your shelter survey questionnaire? That's kind of up to you, but this is something that you can consider doing. And I believe, a lot of other not a lot of other, but other victim service professionals in the field nationally really have gone to something more like this. Now, let's talk about some other information, pre and post test. That's always good to measure change or measure knowledge, but they're also the hardest to kind of manage and administer, unlike a client survey. In-person or telephone surveys, testimonials, you can get those off your client surveys too. Automated data management systems. This is where you can get a lot of that statistical data off if you need to use that. Some of these systems will allow for you to go in and replicate your client surveys, and then you go in and enter the data, and then at the end of the month or quarter, it will compile it for you. And then if you do training types of services, you can get information through presentations, evaluations, and attendance report. Couple of tips: don't confuse objectives with your activities. I've said this again, you just really need to be familiar with each individual goal, the goals of the grant and the regulations. And in your RFP, you have an appendix for each grant. Review it and make sure you're in line with it. And you have to follow not only the grant guidelines, you also need to be sure to follow the OAIV guidelines. And if you're thinking about changing, adding something, improving, enhancing, always consult with your other staff or colleagues. Now, I am done with just some takeaways I'm going to talk about. Any questions? Okay. So again, I've talked a lot about objectives and goals. I hope that it's been helpful to some folks, and maybe they feel like now they've gotten the knowledge to go back and write some improved goals and objectives for your grants this year. Again, it is competitive, more of a competitive process. Now, anything you want to take away with the session today, because this is going to be all part of the evaluation, is you need to be familiar and use the SMART objective criteria. You need to make sure your agency has the measurement tools to measure your outcomes. And you want to be able to report this. So I kind of got confused there. But these are the takeaways for today after all the information I've discussed. So we have a question. Okay, let's see. Okay, we have a question from Lieutenant Newell. This is going to be a question that I'm sorry that you're going to have to address with OAIV, because this really goes more into the implementation of your grant. So I'm gonna make sure that we get your question to OAIV. Okay, takeaways. Have SMART objectives. Make sure you're measuring your outcomes and make sure you have good tools, because this is what they're going to be looking at, not only in your grant, but during the evaluation throughout the year. Our hour is up, but if anybody would like to stay on for some additional questions, Jan and I will hang around. Thank y'all for joining us. If you want to give me any feedback on the workshop, I would appreciate it, because this is for you all and to help you. And you can email me privately instead of on the chat here. So we're done. We're going to give people a few minutes to get off the phone, and then we will hang around to answer any questions. Y'all have a good day and happy grant writing.